Okay, thank you very much for joining the informational webinar for the Climate Variability and Predictability Program. In FY24, CVP program is holding 2 competitions. One competition focuses on multi-year to decadal climate variability and predictability. The program has 2 informational webinars that focus on this competition. One of those informational webinars goes over the program's scope, research that it's funded in this area, and walks through the nuts and bolts of applying to the Notice of Funding Opportunity and the information sheet. Today, that webinar is recorded and available on the website. This webinar is going to focus on the ongoing science and priority areas for this topic, and we're going to hear from 5 different speakers. Our first speaker will be from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. Our second speaker will be from the Atlantic, Oceanic, and Meteorological Laboratory. Our third speaker will be from the Physical Sciences Laboratory, and our last speakers will be from the Arctic Research Program and the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory. Jose, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone, my name is Jose Alguerine and I am the CVP program specialist.
And Jose will be mostly running the show today, helping us with discussion, questions, and slides. I'm Virginia Sells, I'm the program manager for the CVP program. So we're going to hear those different talks, and then there should be 15 to 20 minutes at the end of each talk for a question and discussion period. And so if we have questions during each talk, we'll kind of identify that time and let you know. Otherwise, please hold your questions until the end, and then we'll open it up to questions for each speaker. With that, I am going to turn it over to Tom Delwerg from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory.
Great, thank you. So, okay, show screen. And is my screen good?
Yep.
Perfect, thanks very much. All right, so first, very brief overview of some of the activities at GFDL related to the topic of this call. I'm from the Seasonal Decadal Variability and Predictability Division there, and just our foci, our goals are these 3: improving understanding of phenomena on seasonal to multi-decadal timescales in the climate system. We hope that leads to the development of leading edge computer models and prediction and projection systems, which hopefully can result in improved seamless predictions and projections. So seamless meaning a common system across time scales, because it is a unified problem. Okay, I'm having, there we go, okay. So we're engaged in what we like to call seamless, seasonal to decadal prediction and projection of climate extremes. And by this, I mean the following, that if we look in the purple box, we have predictions. We view those as initial value problems. So we take some observations from the system, put it into a model assimilation initialization system, in this case, something called SPEAR, I'll describe in a minute, and then we make predictions. And we do those on seasonal time scales as well as decadal. So those are initial value problems. Projections in the red box are more boundary value problems. We give a model estimates of changing atmospheric composition, aerosols, greenhouse gas, et cetera, and we use those to make longer timescale projections, decadal longer climate change projections of the system. We're doing these 2 activities, which are oftentimes separate models and systems within a common unified system. We like to think there's some advantages to that very common approach. So by predictions in the upper left here, we can see, for example, how tropical Pacific Ocean temperature, such as El Nino, will evolve in the coming months. And then projections, how these statistics of Pacific Ocean temperatures, El Nino, will change in response to increasing greenhouse gases. And so we try and approach this whole topic within a very unified or seamless fashion. We use something that we call GFDL SPEAR, where SPEAR stands for a seamless system for predictions of Earth system research, composed of a MOM6 ocean model, AM4 atmosphere, LM4 land, CIS. Those are models developed at GFDL. And again, we do this very seamless predictions and projections. We have various resolutions, for the model that we use, from anywhere from 100 kilometers in the atmosphere and ocean out to about 25 kilometers in the ocean and atmosphere. Of course, cost goes up as the resolution becomes very much finer, and there are trade-offs that go along with that. But we think this a wide spectrum, wide suite of different models can have utility in a number of different phenomena. So as we go to what we actually do, we do experimental real-time predictions. That's the initialized prediction part of the issue. We participate in the seasonal time scale, the North American multi-model ensemble, where every month we make predictions for the next year and contribute those. We also participate in real-time prediction on the decadal time scale through the World Meteorological Organization organized decadal prediction hosted through the UKMO. So on the seasonal time scale, this is an example on the upper right of a March 7th of this year email from GFDL, the National Hurricane Center, sharing GFDL seasonal hurricane outlook for 2023. You don't have to look at the words, but just we're actively involved in experimental predictions, not just of ENSO, but of a host of other quantities. Hurricane activity in the Atlantic and in the Pacific is one of those activities. We don't just do real-time predictions, we're trying to better understand the system that can lead to new predictive skill. So for example, here's some work looking at atmospheric river seasonal predictability, seasonal to multi-seasonal actually. And so this is from a paper by Nat Johnson, but looking at really advancing our multi-seasonal skill for predicting atmospheric river activity. So this understanding is combined with prediction activities. So looking also at cold extremes, seasonal prediction in North American cold extremes in the GFDL forecast system. So both understanding and real-time predictions as part of the system. On the longer time scale, we participate in this World Meteorological Organization coordinated activity for the global annual to decadal climate update. Here's a summary of things in a lot of different centers around the world that participate, but we do these sorts of predictions every year. And really here, we're trying to capitalize on long time scale variations in the ocean that can give rise to predictive skill on multi-year to near decadal time scales. So on the longer time scales, those previous slides talked about the initial value problem, looking at actual predictions of the system, initializing the system with observations, and then making predictions and trying to better understand that system. On the longer time scale, we use the same system for decadal to multi-decadal climate change projections. So we're running a sphere many times, generating lots of different possible future climate change trajectories and providing this range of possible future climate states. And so this is really important for us because it allows a quantification of climate risk. For example, the likelihood of changes in extremes, precipitation, wind, or other things like that, part of the climate ready nation, part of big NOAA goal. We use the combination of seasonal predictions and long-term projections for ongoing better understanding of the attribution of different climate change signals. So as examples of these projections, large ensembles, in the upper right, we're showing a larger ensemble of simulations of something called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC. So the x-axis is time, the y-axis is the strength of the overturning circulation. These different colored lines show different ensembles with different rates of forcings. Green is a natural forcing, and these other lines down here are different estimates of future changes in greenhouse gas emissions. They all weaken, but the amount of weakening goes along with the amplitude of the emissions. Overlaying here are the observations, relatively short observational record at 26 degrees north. You can see it's very short, very difficult to make definitive conclusions about trends or other sorts of attributions. All we can say is right now the model is quite consistent with the observations, but it'll certainly take a bit longer to really detect some signal. Another example is shown on the bottom right. This is an example looking at extreme precipitation over the northeastern US from our large ensembles. This is now a large ensemble with models of varying resolution. We include in this green line here the finest resolution we have, which is the 25-kilometer atmosphere and the 25-kilometer ocean. And again, the x-axis is time. The y-axis is now the frequency of extreme precipitation events over the northeastern US. And this is particularly relevant given events of the last week, where we had a number of different very extreme rainfall events, both in Vermont as well as in Pennsylvania. And so x-axis is time. The black line shows an observational measure of extreme precipitation events over the northeastern US. And these different colored lines show model-based estimates of projected changes in extreme precipitation. And one of the key points here, this green line, which shows the closest match in terms of amplitude of extreme events, is from our highest resolution model, something we call SPEAR High, 25-kilometer atmosphere. The other lines here show increasing trends, but the amplitude of the extremes are progressively lower. This dashed line here and the dotted line here are down quite low. Those are both from the 100-kilometer versions of either the NCAR model, CSM, or the GFDM model, spear low, showing that you really need high resolution, at least in the modeling systems, to simulate quantitatively extreme precipitation events over the Northeast United States. So these are examples of climate change projections. We do many, many of these for understanding extreme events. This extreme event US precipitation diagram is from a paper by my colleague Bortin Zhang, published earlier this year. So future directions of where we're going in terms of our activities, this broad suite of seamless prediction and projection activities, trying to better understand the system, translate that understanding into the development of improved models that can provide more realistic predictions and projections. Moving, of course, to higher resolution, because we see the relevance of high resolution for especially extreme precipitation events and others. We're using something called SPEAR High 25, also something called SHIELD, which is a very high resolution atmosphere-only model developed at GFDL with the global resolutions as fine as 3 kilometers. So combining a sort of suite of models across resolutions is very, very important. One of our really key goals here is projecting hydroclimate extremes and heat extremes over the US for the next several decades. Particularly, we saw these increase in extreme precipitation events simulated in the northeastern US. Can we quantify that better, and those extremes over different parts of the United States, as well as extremes in tropical cyclones and other sorts of extreme events? So we're also exploring possible climate futures, looking at alternate future scenarios of emissions and what impact does that have on things like extremes, or even the issue of climate change reversibility. If we reduce emissions, how long or how rapidly will those climate change signals recover to more normal conditions? Other foci are looking at the role of the ocean in seasonal to multi-annual predictions, a key thing there. Also trying to play a large role or extensive role here in the use of analogs or machine learning and artificial intelligence for efficient statistically based predictions. I think that's a wide open frontier. We're very excited about that. Also, a lot of these prediction systems really depend crucially on initialization techniques. So really keen on investing in improving those initialization systems for prediction. So with that, I'll end. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. So that's going to take us to our next presentation, which is going to be by Jose Lopez, and Jose will be advancing slides. All right.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So, okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm an oceanographer at NOAA AOML, and today I will give you a brief overview of ongoing work, capabilities, and research priorities at AOML regarding this CVP call. And I compiled this into 5 topics listed here, and with the point of contacts also listed. And by no means this is all we do here at AOML, but this is probably the most relevant work that we're doing regarding to CVP. So please, next slide. The first research topic is looking at the MLC and the meridional overturning circulation and observing systems with regard to the MLC. And this is very important because the MLC has been known to be a major distributor of heat, salt, and carbon within the climate system. And thus we need to accurately represent the MLC, and thus to know the past, present, and future of the MLC. So AOML scientists are looking at leveraging different observing systems in order to better represent the MLC, not only from the observational perspective, but also from the climate modeling perspective. So we want to characterize this circulation and quantify the uncertainty in the observing systems and different observing systems, and hopefully determine an optimal way of expanding the current observing system, and as well as to investigate the different impacts that the MLC could drive. For example, impacts on extreme weather, climate in general, as well as the rising of the BGC by geochemical modeling, and how does BGC and the physical aspects of ocean circulation interact. Next slide. And this is an example within the same topic area of MLC and observation. This is an example work performed here at AOML that uses XPT, which is expandable bathythermal brush, where to measure and sample the vertical structure, thermal structure of the ocean, and from that infer ocean circulation as well as associate meridional heat transports. And we use these XPTs in conjunction with other platforms, observational platforms and reanalysis product to reconstruct volume and heat transports driven by the MLC, and thus hopefully improve not only the understanding of the physical aspects, but also estimating the impact of and the role of the MHT or meridional heat transport in global circulation, not only in the ocean, but also in the occurrence of climate and extreme weather events as well. Next slide. Switching gears to slightly different topics, there's a significant work here at AOML that looks at sea level. Sea level is very relevant. It's a relevant problem, especially for us here living in South Florida, but also going up to Cape Hatteras and for the entire Gulf Coast. And scientists here at AOML has found that the North Atlantic tripole mode, which is a sea surface high, sea surface temperature mode of interannual variability in the Atlantic Ocean, is largely driven by changes in the MLC. And this is very important because the tripole mode has been shown to modulate interannual variability of sea level from Cape Hatteras down into the Gulf Coast up to 80%. So you can account for up to 80% of the interannual variability of sea level changes to this tripole mode. And very interesting, this paper I'll show here in the right by one of my colleagues, that up to 50% of the flood events south of Cape Hatteras could be attributed to changes in the tripole mode since 2015. So AOML is currently exploring different mechanisms that drive sea level changes and linking it back to ocean circulation and the MOC. Next slide. The third research area that we're very interested in is the impact of anthropogenic climate change on the occurrence of extreme weather events. This is an example here that we're looking at. This is an ongoing work that we're looking at extreme hydroclimate events. And this is mostly motivated by a recent paper that came out in collaboration between GFDL and AOML that looks at future changes of interannual variability of El Niño, which is the major mode of climate variability in the Pacific. And motivated by that, AOML scientists are looking at a potentially enhancement of the hydroclimate when it comes to extreme flooding and extreme drought events. And I'll link back to enhancement of the interannual variability of ENSO in the future. As shown here in the left, these are the future projections of Niño 3.4 standard deviation from observation, and then the SPEAR model from GFDL. You see that there's an upward trend, and this upward trend is projected to continue into the future. So we might expect more enhanced interannual variability and more occurrence of extreme hydroclimates. Next slide. This also falls back into the notion of enhanced hydroclimates as well as enhanced interannual variability of major drivers of severe weather outbreaks in the US. And this work is also motivated by future projections of ENSO being enhanced in the future. And so we're looking at potential spatiotemporal changes in tornado activity at the S2S timescales. And there's a few questions that we want to answer is how and to what extent these projected near-term changes in the US severe weather outbreak will affect us in the future and potentially being modulated by the major climate modes like ENSO, the PN8, and the MJO future projected increases. Next slide. This is an ongoing work as well from our colleagues here at AOML that's looking at projected changes in Atlantic hurricane activity. And this is fairly different from most of the previous literature, is that we're not looking at changes in the mean activity. We're looking at changes in the year-to-year extreme swings between active and inactive seasons. And as you see here in the left, this is just the observation of accumulated cyclone energy, which measures hurricane activity for a season. And there has been an upward trend, but that upward trend also shows more extreme active and inactive season in the later period than the earlier period. So we ask the question whether this will continue in the future. And we're planning to use numerical models as well as proxies for estimating hurricane activity in the Atlantic to hopefully gain more information on what a future hurricane seasonal outlook would look like. And if this validates in the future, let's assume like this plot on the right, suggesting that in the future climate, there will be more extreme active and extreme inactive season at the expenses of the near normal season. So the PDF will shift, which will suggest that the current NOAA seasonal outlook for hurricane will provide increasingly more important information for the public. Next slide. Shifting gear to the fourth research topic area. Here, scientists at AOML are looking at climate change impacts on the corals and their ecosystem. This is a targeted study that look at Florida Keys specifically, because this region is very, very interesting because 70% of the reef in the Florida Keys are losing more habitats than they are creating. So over time, the stressor-driven trends will lead to the loss of ecosystem that these reef hold. So AOML has created a dynamical habitat persistent model that predicts how much habitat will be created or lost over time. And this dynamical model was applied to the specific coral reef shown here on the bottom left. And the results show that with this model, that CO2 emission reduction will be necessary in tandem with restoration of corals. And AOML is hoping to expand this work to other regions that might be affected by anthropogenic climate change and CO2 increases, and hopefully incorporate more ecological relationships as well. Next slide. This is the last research topic area that I want to talk about. And this is one that's very interesting to me, where this is part of an effort to investigate carbon dioxide reduction, and it's basically negative emissions. And it's been shown that negative emission is needed to limit global warming. So a collaboration between AOML and GFDL is aiming to assess marine carbon dioxide reduction, how that will help mitigate potentially reversing the effect of anthropogenic climate change on ecosystems, as well as to better understand potential risks and benefits of different reduction options shown here on the right, for at least for the marine ecosystems perspective. And also I want to note that some of the AOML scientists has authored an aid in authoring drafting of a NOAA special report, which provides strategic directions on marine carbon dioxide reduction with the goal to explore NOAA's role in assessing negative emission strategies and moving forward. And the last slide, I'm just repeating all 5 bullet points and point of contact if you are interested in reaching out and to know more about this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jose. So our next speaker is going to be Matt Newman from the Physical Sciences Laboratory. Oh, are you on mute?
Okay. Is that working? I think that's it.
Yep, we can hear you.
Hear me as well as I can be heard. All right, so I'll just talk for a little bit about some of the interests that we have at PSL. Our interests are generally along the lines of trying to create a better experimental multi-year prediction for both hydrological and coastal ocean resources. So our predictions tend to be focused on water, both in the ocean and on land. And in particular, we're focused on this intersection of what can be predicted, what might be predictable, and what actually needs predictability, what actually needs predicting for a time scale beyond a year. So we're trying to think of things that could become transferred potentially to operations or to use by the general public. We're still thinking of this in terms of monthly to seasonal averages, just extending beyond 12 months. So we're interested in seasonality of the skill, but also in the processes such as ENSO, QPO, oceanic and soil moisture reemergence that give year-to-year memory or multi-year timescales. But the problem with all these kind of hindcasts is that you need a lot of samples in order to really assess the skill, to determine skill from random chance, and particularly to examine changes in skill over long periods of time. So that means long hindcast data sets. That gets very expensive. And so we like taking the alternative approach of trying to construct empirical machine learning approaches to hindcast generation and to analyses of predictability. So one thing that we've developed here to give kind of an example of what we like to do is something we call the model analog technique, where what we do is we go into long pre-existing model simulations, either control runs or historical runs, and essentially we do analog forecasting, but that turns out to work out about as well as if you took the model and did a more traditional simulation initialized hindcast. So you basically can generate forecast ensembles. You can then make predictions, and that allows us to use more smaller data sets. We don't need full three-dimensional data sets to do these kind of forecasts, and that allows us to generate hindcast records going back a decade and even a century. And then we can look in these hindcasts and get a sense of variations in skill, try to understand where they're coming from. So for example, what we find is that if you look over the last 60 years, you see very strong variation in tropical Pacific SST skill. That's pretty well known, but what else this also allows us to do is look at a longer term skill for month 12 or 18 or 24 and identify certain cases clearly related to ENSO here, where maybe there's skill at year 2 at basically month 24 that's equivalent to the kind of skill you would have gotten for that event month 6. So here's kind of an obvious example of this, kind of a classic one for the late 90s El Nino and La Nina period, where essentially these model analogs forecasts initialized in July of 97 basically did a good job predicting ENSO out about 2.5 years. And we can use the ensemble to better understand where that skill might be coming from. And then we want to go ask a more deeper question and ask whether ENSO predictability might have varied from decade to decade, whether this has changed due to climate change. So that basically means going back and using even longer records, using a whole set of pre-industrial simulations. One of the nice things about the CMIP6 effort and all the modeling work that's been done is that there's tremendous data sets that are really kind of underexplored in terms of what they tell us about not just long-term climate change and not just internal variability, but actually potential predictability of the system. So we can use these data sets and apply the same sort of technique. And basically when we do that, we get skill that's comparable, again, to kind of an initialized a model. In this case, the CES5, which is a European operational model. And again, we can see pretty strong variations over the last 100 years in ENSO skill, whether we're initializing, in this case, in the winter or in the fall or the spring, whether we're looking in the model analog skill or whether we're looking at this more traditional forecast method. And there's also clearly a very notable return of second year skill happening during the winter. So there's certainly suggestion of a really pronounced potential predictability in year 2 ENSO skill, and this is consistent with a lot of work that's been done on this in the last few years by a large number of researchers also outside of PSL. What we're also interested in is whether there have been changes in this skill, whether this skill is consistent over the last 100 years, or as it appears to be the case, whether there's been some periods of high skill, particularly year 2 skill, over some decades. So here, a large amplitude increase of skill in the late 1800s, and again, something more recent. And if we see these changes, how much of these changes are due to climate change and how much of these changes are due to internal variability. We know at least some of these seem to be consistent with changes in ENSO amplitude. So if you look at the historical change in ENSO amplitude over the last 100 years, there's some consistency between that and changes in the actual historical skill that we see. Yeah.
So we don't see your slides advancing. Do you think we see your slides advancing?
Yeah. What was the last one you saw?
We're still on slide 1.
Oh, really?
So we can see the like the PowerPoint like menu, like the toolbar at the top.
Oh, really? Let's see, I can stop. And if I start again, what's gonna, I should have said something a while ago.
Well, I wasn't sure. I think can you see, we can also move to Sandy's presentation, and you can send your slides to Jose too, if that works.
Yeah,
or you can continue with your presentation. All right, why don't we switch to Sandy, Lucas, and we'll come back to Matt's presentation.
Yep, I have Sandy's slides here.
Okay. Sorry about that, Matt.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jenny. Matt, sorry about your slides, but you can pick up, I guess, after me. I'm the new director of GOMO's Arctic Research Program. It's located in the Global Ocean Monitoring and Observing Program Office, so different from where Jenny is in the Climate Program Office, but we're a similar set of programs. So I have 3 permanent staff. It's a small program. David Allen is the senior program manager. Cindy Garcia is a new program manager to our group, although she has been working with the Arctic Research Program for the last 1.5 years. And Sarah Tucker is our Knaus Fellow for 2023. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of what the Arctic Research Program is, some of the topics we cover, some of the projects that we fund, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jim Overland, and he's going to talk to you about the science that he does under a funded project from ARP. So ARP, the mission is to aim to improve the fundamental understanding of the ocean, ice, atmospheric processes, and the marine ecosystems, specifically in the Northern Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. And this is to characterize the response to climate variability and change. ARP also supports the NOAA mission capabilities across the Arctic through targeted sustained observing, model improvement and use, and also the synthesis and science communication efforts. Next slide. So I don't have to tell the folks on this call this, but I will. The Arctic is changing. There are several impacts that are really coming to the forefront of our concerns right now. Overall, there's been more open water and thinner, younger sea ice. There's been a migration of key fish species northward. There's also increasing ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms. And there's been a dramatic increase of heat flowing from the Pacific Ocean into the Arctic Ocean, which has a relationship with the growth and loss of sea ice. There's also a link between the Arctic amplification, so where the Arctic is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the lower 48 states, There's a link between that Arctic amplification and mid-latitude weather patterns that may be emerging. So those are some of the topics that ARP covers. Next slide. And click again, please. Yep. So this slide will show you 4 general areas where ARP has subject matter that we're working on. The first and probably the biggest is our ecosystems and fisheries oceanography coordinated investigations. So that's EcoFOSI, and the Distributed Biological Observatory called DBO. These are year-over-year monitoring and assessment of ecosystems and the physical oceanography of the areas that I mentioned earlier. And they have some long-term observations on the order of 10, 15, and 20 years in the Gulf of Alaska, the Bering Sea, the Chukchi Sea. The second topic is more towards modeling, and that's the Coupled Arctic Forecast System, and that's a PSL, so the CAF system. And it's more towards the high resolution coupling of sea ice models for improving operational forecasts of weather and sea ice. GLERL also has a set of projects under us, and that's for informing shipping, transportation routes, and some weather forecasting. Next click, thanks. We fund some sea ice observations, and that's mainly through the coordination of data under the International Arctic Buoy Program and some other observations for sea ice mass balance buoys. And we are the core funder of the US part of the Arctic Observing Network. We fund Cindy Starkweather to identify key contributions to the Arctic Observing System and defining shared Arctic variables at the regional level. And our last is communications and a tool for the year-over-year assessment. It's called the Arctic Report Card. It's similar in assessing the state of the climate system or the state of the system, but it happens every year. So similar to the National Climate Assessment that happens every 4 years, but this is more important because it's a snapshot once a year. So the essays have been going on for approximately 17 years, and it's a really powerful collection of historical information. Next slide. So the future plans and opportunities through the ARP program are sustaining long-term observations and developing and evaluating new observational technologies. We're investing in critical modeling needs. We're trying to be sure and to make our data compliant with FAIR and CARE, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and I'm forgetting the R right now, but it'll come to me soon. We're also supporting relevant and ready usable products, expanding meaningful engagement with Indigenous coastal communities in Alaska, and lastly, improving our partnerships across OAR, NOAA, and between agencies and internationally. So ARP is really collecting the data and information in the Arctic region, Pacific sector specifically, and really looking to build a foundation for the work that Ginny's program, the Climate Variability and Predictability Program, is extending towards process level understanding and mechanisms. So Jim, I'll pass it over to you. Thanks.
Oh, Jim, we're having a hard time hearing you.
There we go. Sandy's already mentioned the report card, and the R is increasing 2 to 4 times faster than the globe based upon what averaging you do. And the point here is that we're beyond, the R is beyond reversibility, particularly related to permafrost and sea level from melting glaciers. Next slide. The impact of the changing Arctic on mid-latitude weather that is where people are interested, continues to be a controversial issue, particularly how much loss of sea ice has to do with it. But certainly on event scales such as the ridge trough wavy jet stream event shown on the right here, leading to cold and snowy weather on the U.S. East Coast is certainly reinforced by loss of sea ice in northern Alaska. Next slide. This one may be more relevant to Wednesday, but it also should be mentioned here. Based on extreme loss of sea ice in 2018 and 19, the large predatory fish from the southern Bering Sea have moved to the northern Bering Sea, and this has precipitated a complete reorganization of the northern Bering Sea ecosystem with catastrophic impacts on coastal communities. This is certainly the largest event that I've seen in my 40-year career. And the issue going forward is actually an atmospheric question. It's what led to this was a breakdown of the Arctic front that allowed the warm air and jet and lack of ice that started the cascade of impacts through the ecosystem. Next slide. So the real issue is whether we're going to see an increase in these minimum sea ice events and their impacts over the next decade or two. And to do that, we'd be looking at both historical analogs and making use of the ensemble results from the climate model to come up with probabilities. So that's all for me. I'll turn it back for questions, or if Sandy has any comments.
No comments from me. Looks good, Jim. Thanks.
So I think we're going to go back to Matt. Jose, could you pull Matt's PDF up, and we will start at slide 7.
Yeah, let me.
And while you're doing that, I'll just say, thank you to all of the speakers. I've asked them to summarize ongoing research and priorities in 10 minutes. And I know that is difficult, and everybody stayed on track in doing that. So after we hear Matt's slides, we'll go to a question and answer.
So let me.
7, right?
Yeah, I think that's good enough. So the pictures that people were not seeing, the basic point is that we're trying to assess ENSO multi-year skill, both in terms of long lead 2 to 3 years, and also variations over the decades, because this is still going to be a very large part of overall potential predictability on these timescales. And so this is just showing Pinecast scale going back to the late 1800s of ENSO, NINA 3.4 on the left, basically SOI on the right, at different lead times. And the key point is that a lot of these variations are coming about because of internal variability of ENSO. There's a kind of a U-shape of ENSO amplitude over the century plus, but that there's also some suggestion of a ramp up of skill, particularly at 12 months in the recent period, which could be suggestive of some climate change. And so trying to differentiate the two of those is very important, obviously. So next slide. And it's something we're starting to do, looking at a long climate model runs. Again, we can take this same kind of model analog approach and actually ask what the perfect model ENSO and actually global surface temperature scale is over different epochs. And what we're seeing here in a couple of different models is one, that there is potential for year 2 scale, which seems to be increasing quite a bit when the ENSO amplitude is increasing, which you see in the CSM here, but which is decreasing when the ENSO amplitude is projected to decrease, as you see in the GFDL model. So this is a real important question for us. It's not clear that models are able to capture these changes yet in ENSO amplitude, but it is clear that their projection for scale changes is very much going to be tied to whether ENSO is actually potentially increasing or decreasing or not significantly changing with climate change. So this is something we're really very interested in here. And then you can, I think, just skip to the end. It's just, yeah, just to kind of summarize our interests. So our interests are basically trying to get a better handle of changes in multi-year predictability, which seems to really require getting the seasonality of the predictability that requires very long hindcast data sets that have to be initialized pretty frequently, every month really, and trying to develop new techniques to generate these kind of hindcast data sets is, we think, of real importance, because trying to do this in models is just really too expensive. And that might give us better understanding of changes to predictable hydroclimate and coastal impacts that are resulting from these changes, not just in ENSO, but in other parts of the climate system. And I think I'll just stop with that.
All right, so that opens it up for our question and discussion period. So how we're going to run this is you can type your questions into the chat, and those are your identity is anonymous. If you'd like to come off mute, you can let Jose know you'd like to come off mute and ask your question yourself. And I think Jose has to unmute you.
Yeah, and if you would like to do that, just raise your hand. There's a raise your hand feature, and that will let me know that you want to be unmuted.
And Jose, you're going to read the questions off from the chat. Okay.
Yep, we have no questions so far.
So while we're waiting, do the speakers have questions for each other and hearing the different talks and work going on?
All right, we do have one question from the audience. Let me unmute. Trying to unmute the person here. Not working. Okay, there we go. Yep.
There we go. Thank you very much for these presentations. Very, very interesting. Specifically to this call, I wonder whether NOAA's interest is primarily in analyzing the NOAA models, particularly the GFDL models that Tom Delworth presented, or whether there's interest in bringing to bear other models that are run either nationally or internationally.
I can start with that. So CVP doesn't limit proposals to using only NOAA models. The applicants are able to use multiple models and applying to the call. We do emphasize the significance to NOAA, so the proposal still needs to address that, and so we have an LOI process, and so I would encourage applicants that are submitting LOIs that they also focus on the relevance to the competition and the relevance to NOAA in those LOIs to give you kind of specific feedback for that question. But again, CVP doesn't limit proposals to only using NOAA models.
Thank you.
Do other panelists want to add to that?
I mean, I guess I would say the best model is a multi-model ensemble. So I think it would be a mistake to restrict yourself to just NOAA models from a science perspective. I mean, I wouldn't restrict myself to an NCAR model for the same reason.
All right, we have 2 questions in the questions box. So the first one is for Tom. Does GFDL plan to make more variables or more time resolutions for variables publicly available for the SPEAR large ensemble datasets?
Yeah, thanks. Right now, we do not have such plans. It's a matter of resources and people to do that. There is some additional funding, I think, that is coming to GFDL to do exactly that. I don't know the timeline on that. That'll be more of a centralized activity. So I think at some point that will happen. I just don't know the timeline on that. Right now, it's I think this is a common problem, but hopefully we can address this through some additional resources.
And the second one, I think, is for Ginny. Since there were so many different foci presented today, is there a prioritized list for the call from this year? Tropics, Arctic, sea level precipitation, etc.
There is not a prioritized list. So that was one of the reasons we expanded the focus for this topic in this iteration of the competition and are highlighting and emphasizing the ongoing work and the prioritized list of other kind of NOAA research groups. But it's quite open.
And the next question, what is the role of simplified idolized model among these studies? Are there any value of them in this program?
Can you repeat that question, Jose?
What is the role of simplified idolized model among these studies? Are there any value of them in this program?
So I would say projects that CVP is funded has employed multiple hierarchical modeling approaches. And so those could be included. Again, that's a general question, so I would emphasize that they submit an LOI to get a more specific response. And then I don't know if others have answers for how that's relevant to their research.
We do have time for more questions, so if anybody else have any questions, just type it or raise your hand.
I can elaborate on, I think, the question about the different topics. So I'd really encourage applicants to look at the larger strategic documents for each of those topics. So I think sea level rise was listed. NOAA has a coastal inundation and climate timescales white paper. I think someone mentioned hydroclimate. NOAA has a precipitation prediction grand challenge. So within those topics, there are guiding NOAA strategic documents. And those are listed in the competition information sheet.
A new question has come up. How about data availability about SPEAR Decadal climate prediction system? I think this is for Tom.
Right now, we contribute our data to the UKMO project where, I don't know, a number of centers around the world provide their decadal predictions too. So right now, that's the source. I don't think there's a lot of data there, but there is some data there that I would urge people to go to for, and all the models contribute to that center. So if you look up UKMO decadal, I think it'll take you to there. It's not a whole lot of data, but that is right now the source for getting that.
All right. And so the next question is, this person is interested in the increase in ENSO variance. Do we know whether this is largely because of increased frequency or increased extremes, or is it both?
I think I'll take that one. What we found is that it's both. It's increasing amplitude and increasing the stream swings between El Nino and La Nina. So, and this is, of course, using large ensembles and using multiple models, CIMIC-6 models with different scenarios, is that we found that if we define ENSO the way we define it now, using 20th century, early 21st century parameters like standard deviations, El Nino and La Nina will become more common. And so that calls for that hints at enhanced stream swings between active El Ninos and active La Ninas and less of a neutral climate. That is from multi-model ensemble. Of course, different model has different biases and different representation of what a future El Nino would look like. But we also look at other the effect of ENSO on impacts, on like well-known climate impacts, and we also see the same manifestation of more stream swings, for example, in future hurricane seasons, where you may have more stream, like 2005 hurricane season, very active, but also more quiescent season like 2014, for example, with very little storms. But each model shows different results, but these are taken from the multi-model mean. And I agree that that should be the approach right now, still multi-model approach. Even though you can draw a lot of conclusions from a single model large ensemble simulation, you can potentially filter much better natural variability versus mean climate changes. You're still dealing with a biased system. So you have to keep that in mind when using a single model.
I think I would just add that it's not entirely clear if there's an increase in ENSO under climate change yet or not. Depending on which SST data set you look at, certainly you don't see an increase in variance since the late 1800s. The SOI variance in particular, it's striking for its absence of an increase over that period of time. It's very much a U shape. And there are some models that show a decrease. And so there's no reason for us to assume that because they're in the minority that they are somehow wrong. So I think that's actually a really interesting research question. Is there a way we can constrain our future projections of ENSO based on what we've seen so far and based on various aspects of the models, including the process errors that they may or may not have? I mean, to me, I think this is entirely open. We don't really know it all. And it's a very important question that we don't really have a good answer for.
Next question is for Ginny. The seminar mentioned machine learning and artificial intelligence a few times, but the information sheet does not reference them, only data analysis and coupled models. Are machine learning focused work applicable to this call?
Yes, I guess for me, machine learning can be a method used for data analysis. So we didn't really call out all of the different methods that one can use. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are a science and technology priority area for NOAA, and so certainly that is applicable to the call. And I think we'll take maybe one more question and then wrap up.
Yep, I'm not seeing any more questions on the chat box or in the raise your hand feature.
Perfect timing. So, again, the program encourages but does not require collaborations with NOAA. The goal of the competitive research opportunities is to complement, extend, and accelerate NOAA's research and priority areas. So thank you for your interest in this topic. NOAA has a lot of research going on in this topic. LOIs are due August 18th. They are encouraged but not required. So with that, I think we'll end. And again, thank you to all of the presenters.
And this webinar was recorded, so we're gonna upload it to the website. And if you have any questions, just email either Jeannie or myself or both of us if you have any more questions about this call. Thank you.